Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today. We'll spend the next 4 hours hearing interventions from distinguished panelists representing various sectors that relate to the important topic of just transition and climate change, and delving into consultation sessions where we hope to hear, hopefully, more participants' perspectives on the topic. Today's event is co-hosted by OHCHR's Regional Office for the Pacific and Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, with support from UNDP's Business and Human Rights in Asia team. My name is Chiaki, and I'll be co-facilitating the session today with my colleague Madeline. I would now like to introduce Ms. Heike Ellefsen, the regional representative of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for the Pacific, for her opening remarks. Thank you, Heike.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and good morning, Bolavanaka from Fiji, and welcome to everyone. The Secretary General has said that climate action that is not anchored in a human rights-based approach risks further violating human rights, and I think for our office this is a very key statement as regards the issues that we are about to discuss in today's dialogue. We're all well aware of the disastrous consequences that climate change has in the Pacific, where the lives of the communities here are very closely intertwined with marine biodiversity and healthy oceans, and they're uniquely vulnerable, of course, to natural disasters. These consequences directly and indirectly affect human rights, and very often it is not obvious to everyone that there are very specific linkages to human rights, including the rights to life, to food, to health, and to water, and also more broadly other rights, including the rights to freedom of expression, assembly, participation, information, which we will surely hear about during today's dialogue. We've also seen that the climate crisis has, in fact, exacerbated social and economic inequalities and discrimination, and it has disproportionately affected those who have least supported it or produced any outputs that would have led and contributed to climate change. So we have just had the big COP gathering with member states and policy experts and academics and non-governmental organizations, and we have seen that there was an attempt to tackle the climate crisis. Among the priorities is obviously the critical issue of phasing out fossil fuels to achieve global net zero. And also, while there are some milestones, the negotiations were quite divided. As we've all seen, we've just seen that there's been an outcome, a negotiated compromise outcome with a transition away from fossil fuels to preserve the 1.5 degree goal that was called for in the Paris Agreement. And we have again seen the Secretary General say that the era of fossil fuels must end, and it must end with justice and dignity and equity, in fact, he said. But what we do see, and again have seen, and our colleague Madeline was in COP just having returned, is that it is very frequently not a given that human rights are linked in these texts, that there is a focus, a spotlight on human rights. We know that a number of stakeholders have actually developed plans to implement energy transition programs based on these commitments and previous commitments. But globally, the practices and also their articulation really continue to fall short on specifically recognizing and mentioning human rights dimensions in various programs, including in the various funding mechanisms and tools that we have to support their implementation. And meanwhile, the critical minerals that are needed for the just transition in the energy sector in particular raises new risks for people, especially for vulnerable groups, including women, indigenous peoples, and others. But the latest IPCC report has clearly outlined that rights-based and participatory approaches lead to more effective and sustainable climate outcomes. And ensuring that the transition is just requires safeguarding the rights of formal and informal workers, their participation, their representation, and that of their communities and people in vulnerable situations. So that justice requires a participatory and inclusive transition, which seeks to remedy past human rights harms. We do know that there have been a number of human rights violations and harms and distressing developments in the last decades, including here in our region, connected to mining of minerals, connected to other types of business violations of human rights. But we've also seen attempts to counteract them, attempts to work jointly together on constructively engaging around these issues and to making this just transition better. So we'd like to hear about those positive developments as well. Because under human rights law, states that act individually and collectively are obliged to mobilize and allocate the maximum available resources for the progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as for the advancement of civil and political rights, and of course for the right to sustainable development. States must also cooperate, must not forget this, in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And this cooperation must include sharing resources, sharing knowledge and technology for climate action. We've just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, last 10th of December on Sunday. And this UDHR, which was this milestone document drafted by many different people with many different cultural and social and economic backgrounds from various regions of the world, including from the Pacific, have recognized that there is an inherent dignity in every human person and that everybody has equal and inalienable rights. And that this is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. These are grand statements, but we have to remind ourselves that these are also applicable to one of our newest crises, the climate crisis. And we remind ourselves also that it was only last year that after a concerted effort by many civil society, by many experts, by Special Rapporteur, special procedures of the Human Rights Council, and by many in regional organizations and NGOs and civil society and the United Nations, the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable development was adopted by the General Assembly after having first been adopted by or proclaimed by the Human Rights Council. And it was only last year, 74 years or 73 and a half after the adoption of the UDHR, but it is such an intrinsic and important right as one of the key rights that we are having to deal with these days. And we must make sure that we work together jointly to make the UDHR a reality so that we have a secure, equitable, and inclusive future. In the context of just transition, the United Nations guiding principles also provide us with the guide towards the right direction and certain clarity about the roles of businesses and how they must support this goal. And these obligations and responsibilities, of course, also apply to the impacts of climate change on human rights, more broadly speaking. So we have to be responsive to the multiple vulnerabilities that people face, the intersectional discrimination, the marginalization experienced by individuals. And in that sense, human rights must also be at the center of governance in policies that will determine how people can engage around climate change and the climate crisis, that they can actually have a voice. Businesses must be at the forefront of also ensuring that the role of the private sector is critical in giving people a voice, and that they integrate, that businesses integrate human rights into their practices, that they implement a do no harm principle and exercise due diligence when they carry out their activities, and also empower those communities that engage with businesses, that wish to engage with businesses, and that they be regulated by the states who ultimately are the duty bearers to ensure that there is regulation, but also to ensure that there's sufficient civic space and engagement by those who wish to be part of the decision making. I believe that we've seen at this latest COP how important it is to allow for significant and sufficient civic space, and the jury is still out on whether that was in fact the case in COP. I will leave it to others here on this call and some of the speakers perhaps to give us their impressions on this one. But we salute the role of civil society. We believe they play a crucial role in strengthening the compliance of businesses and calling upon compliance of businesses and states and other duty bearers, and to keeping governments accountable, especially the young people in civil society, the youth, who've been playing such an important role here in the Pacific, in the broader climate change and climate justice movement. What's really critical important is this meaningful participation of communities. So finally, we have to ensure that this transition away from fossil fuels is just, equitable, and grounded in human rights, and it doesn't create new forms of human rights crisis and environmental rights abuses, but it actually works together with the human rights impetus to advance also the sustainable development goals, which is very important, and which I'm sure the Special Rapporteur on Development, if he were able to be here in this meeting, would probably also highlight. He's currently on his way back from COP and is therefore unable to join us today. So with that in mind, over the next year, we will be looking at business and human rights from this perspective, and look a bit more about on the issues relating to the extractive sector, issues relating to just transition, but also perhaps a little beyond just transition. And we'd like to hear different perspectives from you. We will be having a fourth Pacific Business and Human Rights Forum later in the year, probably in Q3 of the year. And we would welcome your thoughts on what we should feature. This is the second part of our consultation today. I thank you all, and I thank my colleagues for organizing this meeting together with the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, together with our friends and colleagues from UNDP and from others. And thank all the speakers and look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heike. Now we'll go straight into the first session, which is the panel discussion on just transition. We have a distinguished and exciting panel today representing various sectors, including civil society, academia, private sector, and the International Development Organization. I will introduce the panelists now in no particular order. But before I do that, a quick announcement that this panel discussion will be recorded so that we are able to share it with other colleagues who were interested in joining but could not. But we will stop the recording for the consultation session to allow for active and candid discussion on the topic. So for the panelists, first we have Ms. Vani Satanasinga, Executive Director of Fiji Council of Social Services based in Suva. FCOS is a national CSO platform that was established in the 1960s to represent CSO voices to government on social development issues. Vani is the first woman to hold the position since its establishment in 1957. Vani is an accountability advocate and works to leverage community and people's voices into policy and decision-making processes and spaces. Welcome, Vani. Next, we have Ms. Fife Strawn, Director of Land and Inclusive Development at Jubilee Australia Research Centre, an Australian-based NGO that partners with local communities in the fight against extractives and unequal economic system, produces quality investigative research, and advocates for just solutions that center communities. Fife's work focuses on illegal logging in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and the impact of black sand mining projects in Fiji. Welcome, Fife. Next, Dr. Emilka Stupek is Deputy Director of Centre for Energy Ethics at University of St Andrews in Scotland and an honorary Senior Research Fellow at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. Emilka's research explores the nexus of interdependencies that form around resource extraction and the interplay between global economic and political forces and local processes, ontologies, and realities, particularly in the context of a just transition to low-carbon energy systems. Her current research is focused on issues associated with supplying so-called energy transition metals from the Pacific for the global energy transition and the expansion of the extractive industries in the Pacific. Welcome, Enoka. Mr. Howard Politini is the current chairman of the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization. He has had a 47-year work life in several careers, including teaching, quality management, leadership, military, aviation security, human resources, and rural banking. He continues to serve on numerous boards across government, state-owned enterprises, private sector, and faith-based and philanthropic organizations. He is the longest-serving board member of PIPSO and currently in his second term as chairman. Welcome, Howard. And last but not least, Dr. Gillian Kembers is project manager for Global Climate Change Alliance Plus, scaling up Pacific adaptation at the Pacific Community, also known as SPC. She has 30 years of experience in coastal science, climate change, and project management in small islands in the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific Ocean. Since 2012, she has worked with SPC's Geosciences, Energy, and Maritime Division, where she has managed 3 large regional climate change projects. Welcome, Gillian. So we will now hear from each panelist. We ask that each intervention be kept to 5 to 7 minutes to allow for Q&As from audience. But if you go a little over, we're very interested in hearing your contributions. So I think we will like to first hear from civil society representatives on the human rights impact of climate change and associate transitions. So Vani, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chiaki, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm just going to ask if you can share the presentation from your side because we have a little bit of connectivity issues here. If it works, great. As you're pulling that up, so I'm just part of what I hope to present today is really based on the experiences that we've had as a local civil society that is locally established. Part of our experiences and our reflections as we're, maneuvering in the just transition, the climate change, business, and human rights nexus. Next slide, please, Jack. I thought that given that I will be sharing on our experience, I'd have to give you a little bit of a background and to give you some context into what EFCOS is and the work we carry out. Some of that has been mentioned already, but what might be key out of the particular slide is that we're a CSO platform. I think in the 90s that would be considered an umbrella body, and there's an interesting aspect in our organizing structure, which I will share with you later. Is that we cluster our members into districts with a bit of an area-based approach. We do the work that we carry out here at EFCOS, and so we have about 19 district platforms across the 4 divisions in Fiji. We have affiliations at the regional level through the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, Civicus at the international level, Forest, EGNA, HelpAge. Because we've been around maybe for 6 years, we are, part of government policy platforms like the Disaster Management Council, the, National Employment Center Board. Had the privilege as well to engage in a few of initiatives that government has done recently, in particular the Physical Review Committee. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm trying to keep to the 5 minutes so I don't cut into other people's time. And the next slide is really just a depiction of how we, our organizing structure as EFCOS. It's, we've got, we do work from the national to the subnational, to the district level and to communities because of the nature of our members, of the membership structure. but they form the council, and we act as a secretariat, and the secretariat does work more at the national level. Slide. Jackie, thank you. Slide. And so we come to our strategic plan where we've got S3, and we've tried to zoom into what matters going forward, and this is really about leveraging community, recognizing the strengths that they bring to not only development, but more specifically climate change and the issues that we're dealing with now with disaster, and really recognizing the need to make that transition, but that it's not just any kind of transition that we want. It's a transition that is just and that is inclusive. And that means preparing communities, which is why our first focus is on communities. There's also an aspect on CSO coordination, because we recognize that in order to reach or to achieve development effectiveness, we've got to coordinate ourselves. There needs to be a bit more coherence in the sector that we're working with. And in order to prepare sectorally for that transition, for I guess the impacts of climate change at that level. And then the third goal is really about making sure that we are positioned well as an organization to do that with the limited resources that we get. We don't have any core funding, but we do try and make use of the resources that we currently have through project funding to deliver on this. And so I mentioned that because of the fact that EFCOS does not have core funding, we have several partnerships, but I've clustered our areas of partnership into four thematic areas, and that's really generally around climate change and DRR. And we've got a variety of partners for that work. We've got some work on public finance management and development effectiveness. We've got some really great support, in fact, from Jubilee Australia, and I note that 5 is on this panel as well. And that's to do with women and Indigenous people's agency and voice, and that's really to deal with, with the extractive industry in Fiji. Human rights protection and countering trafficking in persons is part of the work that we do with some of our divisions, few of the divisions where these issues have come up. So those are the partners that we have in carrying out this work. This is part of what we try and do, is then connect this work to the strategic goals that we have established for ourselves as an organization. Thank you. Slide, please. Thank you. Next slide. So I also wanted to highlight, specifically what, from all of this work that we're doing, what specifically do we do? Go back to the other slide, please, Jackie. The slide before this. There's some specific initiatives on climate change, business and human rights, and and just transition. Currently, we, part of that work. Sorry, go back to the slide that you had just before this. Next slide. Yeah. Yes, of course, initiatives. Currently, this is the work that we are doing with regards to, keep jumping, with those issues. There's some work on public finance management and making sure that people are at the front and center of that. There's an exciting bit of work that we're doing on oversight and monitoring of development projects, infrastructural projects out in communities. So there's a major work being done on our water supply system that's being monitored by our members. Shaki, can you go back to the last slide that you had on just before this? This is the last slide. Yes, this one. one up there. So do you have issues with that slide? Yes, this one, right. So so these are sort of the work that we do with. We've also started to go into specifically just transition. We've just partnered with British HiCom and another partner, from the private sector, to put on solar panels, and that was really because we had to deal with CSO coordination during disasters. And we often found that, power supply was affected, as quite intermittent during those times. It made it difficult for us to be able to do that work, the coordination bit. So that forced us to begin on this journey for a just transition. We've also sold off all of our fleets. We started to look into electric vehicles, and it's important to us to be able to demonstrate to the sector that this is the transition that we've got to go on. But what's exciting as well in this area of work is that we've recently had some meetings amongst ourselves as Fiji CSOs who work on extractive industries, but with communities, to look at how we work together, how we coordinate. And that's in recognizing that a stronger voice is needed to articulate more clearly concerns from communities on the impacts of extractives on them, particularly as they were also dealing with climate change. So, and I must thank Mr. Poltini is also in this panel. We put together a concept because we wanted to see how Fiji civil society and Fiji private sector can come together, and we had put together a proposal which is now will be taken up by MFET next year. It's called the Fiji BizCom, and together we're trying to establish a hub in the northern division of Fiji, where when issues of climate change come up, opportunities for working together, that hub serves to inform our members, both our members in the northern division, on how we work together, how we can collaborate better, particularly for building resilience in communities in the northern division, which is a little bit more rural than the capital here in Suva. And some of the platforms that we've navigated around to be able to push some of these policy recommendations, some of the advocacy that we've done is, around the National Employment Center, where we've talked about employee rights, dignity, even the welfare of families. In particular, we're talking about communities who are facing the impacts of climate change, but its villages are empty because our people are signing up for overseas worker schemes. And so the able-bodied have left, and there's elderly, there's vulnerable members of communities that are left deal with the impacts of disasters and climate change on their own. So some of that policy advocacy goes directly to policy platforms such as this, the Disaster Management Council, the Physical Review Committee, on which we had the opportunity to participate directly in, and of course, being given the opportunity to speak to the Task Force on Relocation and Displacement. That comes under the Climate Change Act. So that's just generally some of the work that we do around this. And then my last slide, Chiaki, is really to maybe share some lessons learned and maybe highlight challenges going forward if you would do it effectively. If we can move to the next slide, my last slide. Just some lessons learned. Having to confront the system that lacks the capacity for addressing climate change effectively across all sectors. And that we found is delaying the process of the just transition. And secondly, just learning, and given that EFCOS was working throughout the waves of COVID-19, we learned that safeguards and human rights commitments in particular sections of the private and public sector was quite weak And I've highlighted an example. When working in extractive, we found that community voices can be fragmented. It's the way that industries have gone in and divided communities. And I know that this has been quite a issue that we've talked about is the weak National Human Rights Institute. And what I saw out of that is that it gave rise to some inspiring community action, and really fosters the civil society organizations to mobilize communities to help out in safeguarding human rights for various populations, and so the opportunity to train ourselves to be watchdogs and to play that monitoring role in the event of a National Human Rights Institute that's quite weak. We learned that we also needed to bridge the gap between private sector and CSO, given the intersecting challenges of climate change, overlaps in law. We might think it's an inconvenience, but really it impacts on the accountability of key government agencies, particularly those who are tasked with the responsibility of helping to mitigate and adapt or to roll out actions on mitigation and adaptation for climate change. And of course, dealing with businesses, playing that accountability role. I think the challenges are quite obvious: lack of inclusion, low legal literacy. If we were to do this, transition, these are the issues that we could overcome: the disparity in levels of access. Just how do we deal with environmental degradation, particularly when you are saying that this is development, this must take place. It will help heal our economy. Legal redress, remedial pathways are pretty unclear. This is affected by territoriality and competition in some sectors when we're trying to work for just transition. There are industries that actually mobilize against it. So that's stuff that we've got to deal with. We encountered, potential corruption outside of main urban centers when we're dealing with climate change. We were working with communities. They still fear about reporting on this, lack of complaints and grievance mechanisms, especially in state structures where communities often look to get that sort of protection. And then opportunities are just about making sure that our efforts are, embed localization. We're specifically looking at community-led approaches and initiatives for resilience and accountability. So it's a more bottoms-up approach. National accountability mechanisms. I think, if we work together as civil society and businesses and private sector, I think we could really do some damage in that area. I think the third one is quite loaded because it's really looking at challenging how we do national planning, strategic planning, really interrogating the philosophical underpinnings of our development approaches. And because it's become a catchword to say people-centered, planet-centered approach, but we don't see that transformation or that transition taking place. So we've got to take time and space to really think that through. And then I think this is an important bit too, is really looking at development cooperation and assessing whether it's meeting national priorities. One is that level. And the second is to see if this is meeting our goals for just an inclusive transition. And the last is really about, really fostering a culture of human rights and awareness as early as possible. And that's to go into the education curriculum and making sure they learn about business and human rights, learning what is a just transition. And I think I've gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bani. Sorry. Thank you very much. And it was very interesting to hear kind of the efforts already happening to strengthen the civil society, private sector partnership, and to bring the voices of the community into kind of a mobilized force for climate change or climate action, rather. Thank you. Over to Fife, please.
Thanks very much, Chiaki. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. Perhaps if someone can let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And it's exciting to be here among the other panelists whose work I really admire. So thanks very much. It's an honor to be part of the event. I am the Director of Land and Inclusive Development at Jubilee Australia. Jubilee is, as Chiaki outlined, an Australia-based NGO that engages in research and advocacy to promote economic justice for communities in the Asia-Pacific region and accountability for Australian corporations and government agencies operating there. So we work in partnership with a number of different NGOs and civil society groups and landowner groups in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands to support their work to promote Indigenous human rights and to protect traditional lands and waterways. So based on this work for my intervention today in the 5 to 7 minute time slot, I'm going to try and focus on a couple of really big picture things. So please forgive me in advance for any clumsy segues between some of these big issues, but essentially I'd like to focus on two current threats to the just transition in the Pacific, effectively in two sections. One, looking at extractive industries posing direct climate threats, such as deforestation and new gas development. So in that sense, threats to the just transition. And then the other part is threats from the just transition, which the resident representative touched on in her address, the role of mining in the Pacific and the human rights and biodiversity threats posed by that and the need for protection of human rights and the environment in that process. And I have a few slides, but not many. So forgive me, you'll be lingering on pictures for a very long time. So the first aspect of the just transition I wanted to touch on is the transition in the Pacific from fossil fuels to renewables and the efforts underway to preserve the ecosystems that are playing an active role in keeping carbon levels lower than they otherwise would be, which is also an important role that the Pacific is playing globally. So right now, from a business and human rights perspective, there's both a challenge and an opportunity for multinational companies that are operating in the Pacific to shift from seeing the Pacific region as it has traditionally been seen as a site of resource extraction for multinational companies to working with governments and communities to supporting the just transition in a holistic way. So Papua New Guinea is an example that I'd like to draw on to start with, of a country in the region where a significant focus of foreign direct investment to date has been on extractive industries that are hindering decarbonisation. As an example right now, Total Energies, in collaboration with ExxonMobil and Santos, are finalising a vast new gas project in PNG, Papua LNG, and there are several other large gas projects in development. The Papua LNG project, over its lifetime, fossil gas extracted from just that one project is anticipated to release the same volume of emissions that it takes the entire population of Bangladesh, which is 169 million people, to emit. So that is a significant new gas project coming online in the Pacific. Civil society organisations in the region, including prominently the Centre for Environmental Law and Community Rights in PNG, or CELCOR, have raised concerns that communities haven't been adequately informed about the project or its potential to lock PNG into a fossil-based economy for decades. But there are also opportunities in the energy sector in the Pacific. So research that we published with CELCOR in 2023 found that in PNG, it's cheaper today to produce electricity from renewable energies like solar or hydro than fossil fuels. So these renewables are already a cheaper option right now for domestic energy production. And on top of this, PNG government agencies have already identified a host of renewable energy projects that, if they all received financing, could supply 78% of PNG's on-grid electricity by 2030, while still meeting the government's quite ambitious targets for increased energy access. So we see a lot of opportunities in the business and human rights space for supporting the just transition, but on the horizon, there's also threats of locking in a kind of extractive carbon-based model of development. Still on PNG, we see that, and now I have a slide, bear with me. We see that PNG is home to the world's third largest rainforest, which is a vast carbon sink, and it plays a vital role in stabilising global carbon levels. But again, we see extractive development potentially putting a spanner in the works. So forestry activities by Malaysia-based logging companies have been eroding this important resource. Last year, 2022 alone, saw the equivalent of 45,000 large shipping containers of round logs shipped off from PNG. So that's around 3 million cubic meters of logs, primarily logged in tropical rainforests. So many of these logging concessions have been implemented without the free, prior and informed consent of the communities. And as I'm sure most people in the room know, free, prior and informed consent is a requirement under the international, under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's also a requirement under PNG law. And many of those concessions are operating in breach of the Forestry Act in various ways. One of the issues that we see in our work is that in the forest sector, community, and I'll give you a new slide, just communities face few opportunities for income outside of logging. So often a logging project for a community is the only way that they can get a new road or a new school building. And so there's a tension there between a challenge there for both the national government, but also the international community and the business community to find ways that we can support communities other than through extractive development. There are examples of community-led agriculture, conservation, and small-scale forestry projects that show us that non-logging livelihoods are possible in rural parts of PNG, but supporting the landowners to live on their forested land and to be able to access the services they need and strengthen the enforcement of their right to FPIC is an absolutely essential component of this just transition and absolutely can't be ignored. So many of the tools that are needed to move away from a kind of extractive economy and towards a more just economic system that respects and protects the environment are already here. I would say the key challenge for companies, and particularly multinational companies operating in the region, is to move away from these old ways of working and to embrace some of these new opportunities offered by the transition to a renewable model of energy. Having said that, it's important to acknowledge that the transition to renewable energy also has its own threats, and to look at the part that mining in the Pacific is playing in the global shift to renewable energy. So while decarbonisation globally is critically important, it is also really important that that decarbonisation transition respects human rights and the environment. So certain minerals provide the technological components of the new post-carbon age: wind turbines, solar panels, more electricity infrastructure and batteries, both for storage and for electric vehicles or EVs. While next generation technologies like sodium batteries, which are made from salt, are coming online, we're still seeing a huge push for minerals to power the energy transition. And copper in particular, and particularly relevantly for the Pacific, plays a critical role at the moment in renewable energy infrastructure and is likely to be in high demand for years to come for that reason. Jubilee Australia, alongside a number of national NGOs, is working in partnership with several communities whose lands and waters are slated to be affected by proposed copper mines in the coming years. So in particular, I'd raise up the Freda River mine in the Sepik region of PNG, the Wafi-Golpu mine in Morobe province in PNG, and the Namosi mine in Viti Levu in Fiji. Through our work at Jubilee and the work that we've been doing with national partners, or that we've seen being led by landowners, we see a real tension between protecting biodiversity and protecting human rights, and between this desire and what looks a bit like a sort of global rush to extract minerals, particularly copper, at the moment at any cost. I'd like to give the example of the Sepik River Basin. I'm not sure. I know Emilka has also worked on this area, so hopefully we're not going to duplicate. But in the Sepik River Basin, which is an area slated for copper mining, but it's also the last untouched wetland in Asia Oceania. The Sepik River itself is the second most biodiverse in Papua New Guinea, and the Upper Sepik Basin has tentative World Heritage listing in recognition of both its environmental and cultural significance. The Freda River mine, which is proposed in the area, is proposed to be the largest mine in Papua New Guinean history and is slated to include a tailings dam, which in circumference is 2.5 times the size of Sydney Harbour, so it's huge. The tailings dam is in a mountainous, high rainfall area with high seismic activity, and should the dam fail, the predicted consequences for the Sepik River Basin would be catastrophic, including significant loss of life and large-scale ecological destruction. On top of this, customary landowners in communities along the river downstream of the mine have been protesting its construction for years and have not provided their free, prior and informed consent to the project. This case, one of many around the region and around the world, highlights the importance of ensuring that the mining for the energy transition doesn't come at the expense of communities and doesn't come at the expense of the environment in the Pacific. New mining projects, even those for important transition minerals, must not go ahead without the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous communities. And that does include communities on the land where the mine is taking place, but also any communities whose lands or waters would be affected by the mine. That's what's covered under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including downstream communities. And communities' human right to a healthy environment is also critically important to be protected. So in short, hopefully I've stuck to time, but just to say we cannot destroy the world to save it, and Indigenous communities in the Pacific should not be required to sacrifice sacred lands and waterways to service the energy transition. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fife. I do really like that quote, cannot destroy the land to save it, or the world to save it. And there are a lot of, I guess, populations that are disproportionately affected by these practices. So it was also good to hear that there are opportunities where if we can enforce business and human rights in business practices, these practices can be changed. Thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Emilka, please.
Great, thank you. Let me also try to share my screen with any luck. Just go to the beginning. Oh, there we go. I hope you can see it, and actually I think it follows out quite nicely from both presentations we had earlier. So thank you so very much for the invitation and for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are, but especially warm good morning to everyone in the Pacific from very cold and rainy Scotland this time of year. As the world takes stock after last week's COP28 in Dubai, this conversation today, I think, is particularly well timed. And my starting premise this morning is this: the need to halt the runaway climate change is incontestable. And there are very few places where this need is felt as directly and severely as it is in the Pacific, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows all too well. So there are no questions really and no debate about the need for action. But what is up for some debate and what requires careful consideration and unprecedented level of coordination and collaboration is how we get there and what pathways forwards do we forge and how do we do it. Energy systems are at the heart of these discussions, more specifically a global transition to lower carbon energy systems, often referred to with a shorthand of a just transition. But what does just and justice mean here? Despite growing commitment to a just transition, there is limited international consensus on what justice issues should be prioritized, the scope and scale of this process, and who should be responsible for prioritizing, resourcing, and coordinating that change. The concept of just transition had its beginnings in the environmental labor movements in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, stemming from the premise that as the world moves away from fossil fuels, workers in those industries should not bear the economic burden of the transition. But myself and my colleagues at the University of Queensland, with whom I explore these topics, argue for a much broader definition. We regard the idea of a just transition as a plural, multidirectional, and multifaceted process that links global actions and aspirations with local realities and impacts, so that attention is directed at both the consequences of transitioning out of fossil fuels but also the impacts of transitioning into the new low-carbon energy futures. And as organizers of today's session reminded us, and speakers before me did also, and what I want to talk about for the next few minutes, is that building these cleaner, low-carbon energy systems and infrastructures will require a significant amount of what we refer to as energy transition metals and minerals. And many of those metals can be found in the Pacific, both above the ground and deep in the ocean. Overall, with my colleagues at the University of Queensland, we identified 163 energy transition metal projects in the region. And on the slide here, you can see a list of countries in the Pacific where energy transition projects are located and the primary commodities extracted or targeted. Now, resource extraction projects in the Pacific have a very long and difficult legacy of human rights issues. Now, in some instances, these legacies last long after the mining operations ended. This is the case at the Panguna mine on the island of Bougainville. There, the mining project left behind a devastating environmental and social legacy, sparking a civil conflict that claimed thousands of lives. In 2020, so over 30 years after the mine shut down, community members represented by the Human Rights Law Centre in Australia started formal action to hold the company, Rio Tinto, accountable for its human rights legacy. Now, so far, the company reluctantly agreed to fund the impact assessment, but made no commitment, to the best of my knowledge, to funding any remedies that might be proposed. Now, in other cases, human rights issues are being raised at exploration stages before the mine is constructed and before mining even begins. And this is the case at the Frida River mine in Papua New Guinea that we just heard about, a highly contentious copper and gold extraction project. Now, as copper is one of the key energy transition metals, company developing Frida River presents the project as critical for the energy transition and achieving net zero, and talks about its role in providing sustainable energy. And this is something we're seeing increasingly in extractive conversations, where the mining industry presents itself as an integral part to the solution to climate crisis, conveniently forgetting that it is the mining and our addiction to fossil fuels that got us into this crisis in the first place. So as the company at Frida River, and I've been working on those issues for over 10 years now, talks about its contribution to energy transition, many voices, including those of 10 UN Special Rapporteurs who issued formal letters, raise alarm about significant environmental and human rights risks associated with the proposed developments. And examples from across the region are plenty. 2 years ago, my colleagues and I started a project to examine whether the concept of a just transition can provide a new framework for more responsible extraction of energy transition metals in the Pacific and beyond. As part of that research, we assembled a data set of the projects in the Pacific that are extracting or proposing to extract energy transition metals. This dataset also mapped the pre-existing levels of environmental, social, and governance vulnerability in the locations where these projects are located. In our study, we used 23 indicators grouped into 7 dimensions: extreme events, water, conservation, land uses, communities, social vulnerability, and governance. And what we then did is we compared the Pacific results from the Pacific subset to a global data set of 5,097 global ETM projects or energy transition metal projects. And you can access the data set and the accompanying methodology note using the QR code here on the screen. And this will also take us to a report we wrote about justice issues associated with resource extraction in the Pacific, which specifically focuses on deep sea mining and also copper mining in Papua New Guinea. Now, overall, our data set points to high levels of situated vulnerability and exposure around energy transition metal projects in the Pacific across all 7 of the dimensions we looked at. When compared with the average results for those projects throughout the rest of the world, the Pacific consistently scores higher. And this provides compelling reasons for concern about increased pressure to extract more resources in the region. Now, we anticipate that the expansion of the extractive industries under conditions of climate change will exacerbate all forms of harm and produce novel compounding forms of exposure throughout the region. We also expect that projects that were previously considered too risky or costly for development, such as Frida River, may have their viability reassessed, where some extractive projects were previously justified in terms of national level benefits that supposedly outweighed local level harm. Some new projects and expansions will most likely be justified in terms of planetary necessity, and we're already seeing that discourse seeping in. As our work progresses to understand the relationship between climate change, energy transition, and extractivism in the Pacific, we developed this concept that we called compound exposure. Now, compound exposure points to the fact that certain regions, sectors, ecosystems, and social groups will be simultaneously confronted by the consequences of climate change and a multitude of other stressors, including those extractive activities that supposedly underpin global solutions to slow climate change. To help illustrate this point, we have developed a basic model of compound exposure in the Pacific. The model emphasizes interdependencies, showing how Pacific places and people are subject to, interact with, and influence broader global processes. And you can see it on the slide here. So moving from left to right, we can see a feedback loop between resource extraction and climate change that is reinforced by the need to access energy transition metals to facilitate a global energy transition. As extractive activities are conducted under changing environmental conditions, this extractive context will become more volatile and large in localized exposure. The arrows travel in both ways because some Pacific leaders prioritize extractive-led development, and these activities and decisions also help to reduce the global extractive industries. Extractive impacts will be increasingly amplified by the effects of climate change, which are disproportionately experienced throughout the Pacific. At the same time, Pacific people are among the most vocal proponents of climate action and work tirelessly to influence international debates and decisions, while locally proposed mitigation and adaptation strategies may be more or less successful depending on pre-existing factors and conditions. Now, finally, these situations are not static. New forms of vulnerability and exposure are likely to aggravate each other because they will overlap and interact across space and time. We need to consider how vulnerability and exposure may accumulate or recede in certain places and periods across the mine life cycle, for example, and changes that occur as feedback loops between problems and proposed solutions compound over time. The vulnerabilities embedded in Pacific settings influence the degree of magnitude of exposure and how people may respond to the compounding effects of the energy extractives nexus. Likewise, dependency upon resource extraction influences how some states and their citizens might understand and respond to climate threats. Once we understand these relationships and feedback loops, we can begin to grasp the future form of exposure and risks that will accompany the expansion of extractive industries under changing environmental conditions, and start to address the disconnection between climate, development, and energy transition policy and planning agendas. So, for example, by attending to the relationship between vulnerability, climate change, and resource extraction, we can see policy and planning prospects that are otherwise hidden from view, such as focus on vulnerability helps us address blind spots present in reliance on investment risk analysis that tends to dominate conversations, but that conceals the real cost of mining benefits. We can also consider ordinary impact assessments, such as ones for Frida River and Wafi-Golpu, cannot grapple with feedback loops. Now, what would an adequate assessment look like, considering that a lot of those projects are assessed now, but will be operating under conditions of climate change, shifting their impacts and effects? Now, we call for more scrutiny of the relationship between different global warming scenarios, changes across different forms of vulnerability, and future geographies of extraction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emilka. Definitely kind of increase or enhance this voice of the need for, the inclusive consultation of communities, especially with the very long-term impact that could provide to the communities. Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Howard from the private sector's perspective, please. And I will share my screen for his presentation. Howard, can you hear us? We may have lost Howard for the moment. So maybe we'll go to Jillian to allow a chance for Howard to come back online.
Okay. Hello to everyone, and first of all, thank you very much for inviting SPC and me to be part of this panel session, and also thanks to the other panelists for very interesting presentations, which I've learned a lot from. Just for anybody who doesn't know, SPC, or the Pacific Community, is the largest technical crop agency in the Pacific, with technical sectors covering energy, agriculture, fisheries, land resources, as well as human rights and social development and education, just to mention a few of our particular divisions. My presentation today will just talk a little bit of a background about the energy sector in the Pacific, first of all. And then I'd like to just present one of many SPC's approaches to the just transition, which is to try and lead by example. So first of all, as we all know, Pacific relies heavily on imported fossil fuels to drive our energy systems and basically to turn on the lights. 80% of the energy generated in the region is fueled by petroleum, and almost 100% of our transport, including maritime and land transport, is still fueled by petroleum. Pacific countries need to continue to make consolidated efforts to have less reliance on fossil fuels and to rapidly accelerate renewable energy and energy efficiency for the region. That's the key to survival of our people and nations. While in the global perspective, Pacific emissions are really pretty negligible, our heavy reliance on fossil fuels results in volatility in our economies, communities, and for individuals, just how to pay the electric bill. During the leaders' meeting in Cook Islands in November this year, our leaders aspired to a just and equitable transition towards a fossil fuel Pacific, acknowledging the pathway is not immediate and is not one size fits all. For this to happen, we have to have action at the global, regional, national, organizational, and individual level. And I sort of present this background against the final findings of COP28, which was our speaker at the beginning of this panel session referred to. And I was searching on the web for it this morning for this specific text, and I'm not quite sure I got the specific text, but this is what I got. The outcome of COP28 calls for a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems and a global stocktake. The stocktake calls on parties to take actions towards achieving at a global scale a tripling of renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency improvements by 2030, as well as several other measures, which I'll not go into in the short time for this presentation. So it gives us targets, but the outcome of the COP28, I know, was disappointing for many. But at least I think from my own personal perspective, it does mention fossil fuel transition, however vague that word is, away from fossil fuels. So I think that's important, as also is the need for a stock take. If we don't take account of what we're doing and just use general statements, we're not going to make much improvement. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, SPC is a large regional organization in the Pacific, and we do have a specific division dealing with energy. But I would just like to present one of our approaches to this just transition, which is to try and lead by example. Excuse me a minute. In 2020, SPC adopted a social and environmental policy with the help of its climate change division and its human rights and social development division. So what does this policy do? Well, essentially it provides a framework, including guiding principles for SPC to manage social and environmental risks and the impacts of all its activities using the people-centered approach. And of course, this people-centered approach, as I think panelists have referred to it before, we all know its importance in the Pacific context, to include issues of gender equality and equity, human rights, youth, persons with disabilities. I need not go on. These cut across all areas of development work in which SPC is engaged. And we're trying to mainstream the planet principles, participation linked to rights, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and transforming norms across all our technical divisions, which is quite a big task. Our social and environmental policy has 3 pillars: SPC people, SPC operations, and SPC programs. And I'll just outline them before giving a few examples of our actions in one of them. Pillar 1, which is SPC people, is basically to provide our staff with a workplace that promotes diversity and inclusion, guarantees equal rights, and provides a safe, healthy working environment. Pillar 2, which is SPC operations, seeks to make SPC an accountable organization in the face of climate change. And Pillar 3, which is SPC programs, the objective is to design a robust social and environmental system, supporting all the programs and projects that we work with our partners in the different countries to implement, whereby we can maximize social benefits. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Pillar 2, which is operations. So what are we actually doing about this? Basically, this area, it involves the assessment of our carbon footprint. We do an annual greenhouse gas inventory to ensure that all our emissions are accurately monitored. And we include a focus on our policies for efficiency and accountability in many of our practices, such as energy, travel, water, waste, events, and procurement. So coming down to the specifics of what we actually do in some of these areas. As I said, we're working to reduce our own environmental and carbon footprint with the ultimate goal of achieving carbon neutrality and zero waste. For example, over the last 6 years, our carbon neutrality fund has amassed €150,000 by reducing our in-house emissions through things like installing solar panels on our new building in Umir. Energy audits have been conducted, and we've reduced our carbon footprint by 1/3 over the last 6 years. Coming on to the second area in which we're applying the policy, ensuring that our policies, such as our travel policy, address climate. And I think it was 3 years ago, we introduced a travel levy on all our travel within the Pacific region, which is quite a big budget item, I can assure you. Then thirdly, we look at our responsibility as regards our spending in the region and beyond. And we've adapted our procurement and grant procedures. So we've embedded criteria focusing on social inclusion, conformity to human rights, and environmental impact in the actual criteria we use to evaluate our different bids in our procurement process. And finally, we've been using a rights-based, gender-responsive approach in all our communications, both internal and external. So these are just some of the ways in which, as a large responsible organization in the Pacific, we are trying to lead by example by taking these measures to help provide an example to others of what could be met by a just transition for a large organization. And I think in conclusion, whether at an individual, an organizational, a regional or global level, we all have to play our part and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and increase our use of renewable energy and adopt energy efficient measures using the people-centered approach. And finally, as a last comment, we have to document what we do and the progress we make, however small. I think that's really important. So thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Gillian. As Heike said and Gillian emphasized that, we all have a role to play, and it's very inspiring to hear what the regional organizations like SDC is doing in the Pacific in this regard. Thank you. I think Howard is back with us.
Yes,
Wonderful.
Jackie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry,
yes.
my internet just dropped right out of, and hopefully it'll stay here. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, and all protocols observed, I say a big bulla from Fiji, although I didn't say it in the other end.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Maybe because I have a little bit of issue hearing you, it's a little bit breaking. Maybe here give you're gonna share the PowerPoint anyway for Harvard, right? Maybe if you could
Yes.
turn off the camera and then maybe that would enhance the connectivity for you. So you could turn off camera and then you can keep speaking. Thank you very much. Thank you, Harvard.
Thanks. Okay, we got the technicals right now. All right, thank you. Again, I just thank all my previous associates who have spoken this morning, and certainly I think you've narrowed down a lot of what I need to say here, because we certainly got a lot of congruency across what we have to say. But again, thank you for the organizers, for the invitation, for the organization that I represent, and as chairman here, which is PIPSO, that was introduced in mine. Now, I'm using a PowerPoint that I used a few weeks ago, not the total one, but there's so much common in it that I just move slides because of the common issues that we seem to be talking about. And so thus this makes reference to the Pacific Labor Movement annual meeting, which was held in Vanuatu 2 weeks ago, a 5-day event attended by over 330 or so officials from government, from private sector, where I was, and actual employers in Australia and New Zealand around this labor movement thing, which is something that's already been mentioned. So can we go to the next slide, please? All right, thank you. This is just a very quick overview of the organization. We're a private sector representative body in the Pacific Islands region. We were set up through the mandate of the Forum Economic Ministers meeting in 2005, which is a branch of the Pacific Islands Forum. So we have a regional government forum, which was set up in about 1969, 1970, and that does a great job of keeping the small island developing states that we're often referred to, minus New Zealand and Australia, but that certainly is part of our region. And so this is the representative conglomerate of PIPSO. Next slide, please. Right, basically we focus on our strategic goals as other organizations and so on. And again, our role is very much one of advocacy to our members who are national private sector organizations. And of course, they have their members, mostly they're from the chambers of commerce in all the different countries. In some countries, they're employer organizations, like in Fiji, where I represent the Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation. Next slide, please. All right, so in the Pacific, as I said, securing the future of the Pacific cannot be left to chance, but requires a long-term vision, strategy, and commitment. This is a quotation from the Blue Pacific continent is our home. This is another of the leaders meeting, or that the leaders have signed to in 2019 in the 2019 Pacific Leaders Communique, the commitment to this up to the year 2050. Next slide, please. Right, this is one there where we talk about opportunities, and I think this is one where we have to put a lot of focus in the Pacific here, where there are opportunities, but again, under this, the topic of what we are around here, the theme that we talk about, business and human rights, and of course, the people aspect of it, it is so much important that I use this theme, if it exists, it's possible. And we've heard that reflected that so far. So can I have the next one, please? All right, this is just a picture parade of the Pacific environment impact of climate change, which you've heard, of the natural disasters that we've had, of the fueling impact, the cost of the fossil fuel, of course, which is used mainly in our shipping, and shipping is a big component of private sector in the Pacific region for obvious reasons. And again, for science, for the land impacts, and of course, the post-COVID response and the experience of that. And of course, the cost of doing business has increased drastically. Next slide. Well, the opportunity sources here, and we did reflect on the opportunities that have been created down at the micro level, down at the rural level, because there's not enough jobs, of course, in the cities is a very old saying around here, and people are discouraged from leaving their villages and rural communities, but there are opportunities for them now, particularly with technology, that they're able to sell their products. And I have direct examples of this in different countries online now, and send it to their own diaspora as far as the United States and Europe and Australia and New Zealand. So these are the opportunities that exist for those deemed to be rural dwellers and those who do not have too much access to tertiary education and so on. But here I've just shown in the pictures there examples of little markets that have been created to allow people the opportunity, irrespective of their technical qualifications, because all that is learnable, but very much the opportunities that exist, and all it needs is some training, some awareness, and just a little education, which is not sophisticated, it's not rocket science, as they say, and of course, looking at the markets that exist immediately around them. Next slide, please. Right, under the business and human rights, I've just put down here that the guiding principles document, I believe, is very comprehensive. It's basically the Bible of what how are we supposed to behave as we try to further our development and deal with our environment. And of course, we've heard several comments to the latest COP28 outcomes and so on in the Pacific. So it's one, though, that has continued to gather momentum for focusing and for highlighting the plight of the Pacific in the environment and so on. And of course, in the business sectors, and every one of you who has spoken before me from your different contexts, of course, have mentioned the fact that, you know, there are people involved, and people are the center of what we do. It's the center of business, the center of our organizations. And so our region is structured, ideally, I say, with the Pacific Islands Forum. And we, of course, have the Pacific SIDS. We had a conference in Tonga just in August and so on. And there will be a bigger 10-yearly one in the somewhere in the West Indies next year, I think. But all of this is continuing to bring together our region at different levels to focus on. And again, everything always comes back to people. And so civil society are certainly very much hand in hand with us. And likewise, we also have the workers, so that the trade union representatives now entering to be part of this, the table, the round table, the public-private partnership that has been driven by the UN and SIDS over the past 10 years. And basically, we are committed to the partnership framework collaboration, to what we refer to in the region as the Talanoa, to sit at the level playing field or the table, and all the stakeholders consult and talk and move through this. And the Pacific Labor Movement annual migration annual meeting in Vanuatu was a classic example of bringing everybody to the table. And again, we recognize our different roles. Government especially have to lead. And of course, we've got civil society and of course, private sector. And you know, it's a leave no one behind in the consultation process. And I think we have structures that are well developed, but of course we can always continue to strengthen. And this, I guess, is one of the objectives of our conference right now. Again, the ILO has also been at work in the Pacific in driving best practice and compliance. And of course, the focus is labor, and labor, of course, is people. So good governance is very much a joint stakeholder commitment, and the different nations do have their own structures around consultation, around arbitration, and dealing with people issues. And in the labor mobility challenge and opportunities, we heard of the challenges of families that were left behind, being away, having their leaders or their husbands and wives in many cases away, and the family have to be looked after by the extended family. And of course, as mentioned earlier, have to deal also with the process of preparation and response to disaster risk management sort of thing. So I think it's great that we have established platforms in which to communicate. And I think that is the whole focus of what we do, is to consult, and of course to recognize the degree of responsibility that we all have, and particularly in private sector where we have the good, the bad, and the ugly, I say, and compliance and governance has got to be enforced and for the betterment of everyone. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so again, we looked at people here. We have a market I went to, and I took these pictures about family-based enterprises and so on. So there's a huge opportunity for, it's not what you do, it's what you know. And so those who can do little home-based activities, craft, art, things like cooking and clothing and so on. There's a huge market out there for our own communities here, and that's something we call opportunity, and it recognizes the integrity of the person. Next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, there's always opportunity to grow. When we talk private sector, we talk business, it's a growth mode. We've always got to grow. You start small, micro, and you grow. Because just like the farm here, which is a fairly large commercial farm, pictures in my neighborhood here, it involves cooperatives, shareholder communities, landowning units, and partnerships of whatever that people like to get together, whether it's a woman, the young people, etc. It's one that does offer huge opportunity for upscaling and growth in business. The next slide. Right, the last slide. That's my basic slide, but the last one again is just a bidding farewell. But thank you, and you to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard. Definitely, the whole importance of people-centered approach came through, and then there seems to be a lot of opportunity for innovation as well. And but with that, the importance of training, education, and capacity building of the people who are affected by climate change and just transition. Thank you. And thank you very much for all the panelists for very interesting interventions. I think we'll open up the floor for some questions from the audience. And anybody's welcome to raise your hands and ask questions or use the chat function. I think we did have one chat earlier with a question. Hetero, would you like to come in to read your question, or would you like us to read your question? Maybe I'll just read it. In terms of a just transition in energy, how do we link that to communities who are struggling with cost of living, employment, and in some parts of the Pacific, basic autonomy? And second question was, Pacific representatives have been calling for this for the last 7 COPs. How much more can the Pacific do with little to no change from the top emitters? This may go to everybody, but our Vani, Faith, and Emilka maybe in particular, and Jillian.
Sorry, Jackie, just reading that comment, I think that's a concern that we all share. I think there's a need to really operationalize some of those global commitments that our governments make. And I find that sometimes governments enter into some of these, they make these commitments, but they don't know what it means. They don't know what it means in terms of policy. They don't know what it means in terms of pivoting services. And that's where I think there's potential for civil society organizations who work with communities to translate to government, because I see our role as standing in the gap. We are interpreting and translating between communities to governments to development stakeholders, and vice versa. I don't think that there is enough of that happening, and I think we need to review as stakeholders what we are doing in this just transition. Where do we position ourselves? And so it really is asks you that core question: what are you here for as an organization? And how do you work to support that transition? And for us as a membership-based organization, we're definitely with communities. And our job, at least we've been trying to do since 2018, is to really play that mediating role. And in some spaces, push community voices into formal policy space, so that governments themselves, are sometimes skeptical about what we present as civil society organization, so that they can hear from communities themselves what their needs are. And there's been talk about a bottoms-up climate finance facility, facilities that will help us with this transition, but we haven't seen that. And so there needs to be accelerated action on aspects on localization. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, hi, please.
Thank you. I couldn't find the hand icon, so I did it old school. But I just wanted to echo what Vani was saying, and I think this is the million-dollar question from Petero. I think, you know, coming from Australia, as our organisation is based, there's obviously a huge part of this discussion is that countries like Australia that have very, very high emissions per capita need to decarbonize at a much more rapid level, and that includes, you know, stopping public financing going to fossil fuel developments and fossil fuel exports. But as well as that, I think, as Vani has touched on, climate finance is key, and we haven't seen the global community, and particularly the global north, stepping up as they should have to deliver the volume of climate finance that's needed, but also to deliver it in ways that address some of the issues that Petro has been asking about, namely, you know, addressing the issues in communities, lack of services, lack of infrastructure, lack of opportunities that communities are often facing. Those two things could be going hand in hand, and we could be seeing more climate finance that is directed at local level initiatives, you know, to create a win-win opportunity. And so, yeah, really seeing the global north stepping up to actually put its money where its mouth is, and commit the climate finance, well, deliver the climate finance that's been committed, increase its commitments, but also ensure that finance is going to local levels.
Thank you, Emilka, and then Gillian, please.
Thank you. Just building on what Vani and Fife said earlier, I think there's one of the big kind of letdowns of COP28 is that conversations about finances have not progressed as much as I think many people had hoped. Energy transition, you know, it's a multi-dimensional challenge, it's a technological challenge. And I think, you know, we've got the technology, we need to figure out the resourcing and availability and accessibility of this technology. It's a financial challenge. Who pays for all of it? You know, for renewable energy technologies, wind is free, sun energy is free. But the technology that you need to be able to translate one into the other, to turn your wind into your electricity, that is very costly, right? And I think that that also creates an issue in terms of, you mentioned autonomy in your question there. I think for a long time there was this kind of hope and aspiration, and still is to an extent, that renewable energy technologies do allow for more decentralized energy systems. But the reality, as we see it in practice, is because of the huge capital investment required to get them kind of off the ground, you see similar chains in terms of companies getting involved, investors getting involved, and debts and price setting, which are quite reminiscent of other energy technologies. So I think that's an incredibly important question, and something that I'm hoping that between now and COP29 in Azerbaijan, that by the time we reconvene at COP next year, people will be better prepared to talk about it more critically and make some commitments in terms of who pays for and what does the equitable share of cost look like. We talked quite a bit today about the impacts and access and inequalities there, but I think there's also a need to think about who should be paying the most for the transition, in order to allow everyone equitable access. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, Gillian.
Well, I don't really have a specific answer to the first part of the question, which is one I ask myself all the time. When we're dealing with communities and individuals that are often struggling, how do we talk about words like a just transition? I struggle with that personally. I think it comes, I think we also have to consider what we do at an individual level. I ask myself, am I 100% conscientious about energy efficiency in my own house? And the answer is, there's a lot I could do more. It's the simple things, turning out the lights. I'm sorry, I'm not as conscientious as I could be. So maybe I have to do more as an individual, trying to move from the individual level up to national politics, regional politics, etc. Is hugely challenging. I'd just like to make a couple of comments on the second part of the question. Sorry, is that my system making a noise? Oh, okay. I'll continue if you can hear me.
Yeah,
Oh,
we can
okay.
hear you. I think Mr. Howard just lost the connections and yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was my system or not.
All right.
Just to make a couple of comments maybe about the second part of the question. Pacific represent countries have been calling on the last 7 COPs to do more. I think my comment on this is perseverance. If I look back over the last 20, 30 years, I mean, it took at least 20 years for there to be sort of more widespread acceptance that climate science wasn't just a conspiracy theory. I think we've moved beyond that now. And we can, I think it's more generally accepted that it's a real and present danger as the literature goes. And as regards the, I think matter of, was it Anika mentioned climate finance and that we need to see that increased. I have a sort of, I totally agree, but I think we also have to look at our capacity and systems within the Pacific to actually utilize more finance. It's all very well to say we need more money, but I work in a regional organization helping and working with partner countries to actually implement many adaptation measures on the ground, and we struggle. It's not a case necessarily of needing more money, but we need more people with the necessary expertise to make these things happen. So it's really a multifaceted question, and just wanted to make a quick comment on that. I think when we talk about more climate finance, we should couple it with building the capacity to actually utilize it in a meaningful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Howard, did you want to come in?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm having a bit of a fight up the valley where I live here with the connections. A few years ago, I got to speak. Every year I get to speak at the leaders' meeting, except this one, there was some confusion. And I said to the leaders, we've heard of this climate financing, the GCF. And I said to them, this GCF sits on the top of Mount Everest. You need to go get it. And all the heads nodded. And that still seems an issue right now, as Gillian has alluded to. But, you know, for us in our different institutions, I think we need to keep our feet on the ground. And as Vani has alluded to as well, be in touch, connect, and just continue to keep our hands with the people that we're trying to. And this is ensuring that we get the so-called tools down there. There is the willingness, there is the need, there is the desire. But through forums like this and forums right down, and we have different structures in different countries, and we have structures in Fiji where we have the rural areas highly organized. They have structures which are existing, and that's where Vani and her group get to connect. And this is where I believe it's feet on the ground, hands on the plow, and for us advocating for where the needs are that has already been covered. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Patricia had a question to Emilka. Thank you, Emilka, for responding on chat. Did you want to kind of elaborate on that question, Patricia? Do we have Patricia? Okay, well, question to Emilka. Does your project addresses address the legal dimensions challenges of a just transition in the Pacific. And then Milka, did you want to kind of explain?
I can, sure. I answered in the chat, mindful of the time as well. But I think it's a very good question. So the answer is yes and no. So it does inevitably include basic overview of things such as policies, agreements. But over the next couple of years, we are planning to focus very specifically on issues of policy capacity and governance. So hopefully in a couple of years, I will be able to report some results from that. And if anybody would like to be part of that conversation, please do get in touch with me. I'm always very, very eager to hear everyone else's thoughts and ideas.
Thank you. I am mindful of time, but if we can get 5 more minutes of the speaker's time, I do have one question representing the UN. We're always interested in kind of seeing where does the UN fit in, because we do talk about, you know, how everybody has a role and there needs to be a lot of consultation. And I think it would be great to hear from speakers. I mean, UN in general, but also the OHCHR's role in the business and human rights aspect in the climate action change talk. It'll be great to hear your thoughts on where should we be really focusing on? What are some of the priorities that we can kind of look into, explore, especially for the Pacific Forum next year? Thank you. And this is a question for anybody. Thank you, Jillian.
Well, maybe I'll take a first stab at it, a personal stab at it. I'm not a human rights expert. Having been working in SPC for the last 12 years, it was really an introduction to human rights in development work. And I found, and as I say, this is a personal perspective, it's not an SPC perspective, and I found a lot of the language you use in human rights a little bit intimidating and scary, like a duty bearer. Heavens, what was a duty bearer? Yeah, sorry, this is what I thought from my own perspective. And obviously our human rights colleagues were able to share and explain. But there's sometimes, and again, I'm speaking as a non-expert in this area, there's a little bit of a, well, human rights is all very well, but how does that affect me as an individual and the rest of it? And what is this language that they use? I'm talking for someone from another discipline, and you know, even sort of working our way up or down the chain, whatever we think, with communities, individuals I know here in Fiji or whatever. How do I explain how human rights really, apart from obviously being inspirational, is really relevant to their lives? So I'd just like to share that with you. And as I say, I'm not an expert at all in this area.
Thank you very much. No, that's, I think, very important, because we do kind of speak in jargons a lot, and that because human rights is owned by everybody, individuals, and not just human rights experts. So it is a very, very helpful contribution to hear that from you. Thank you. Five, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Chiaki. That was a really interesting question, and I think we all needed a minute to sort of think about it. I think one thing that springs to mind immediately when thinking about these issues around business, human rights, and their just transition is that the UN can play a really important role in bringing people together to talk about issues that are a little bit controversial or difficult for perhaps communities and businesses to come together and talk about in other spaces. The UN is a sort of, I guess, perhaps a neutral party that doesn't have a vested interest one way or another, can play a really important role in sort of convening those spaces that bring business representatives together, but also together with perhaps representatives of landowner groups who might be affected by activities of businesses, but that neutral space can perhaps, create an environment for those more difficult conversations, more challenging conversations in the region to come out. I think that's a really important role that BHR has played in the past as well.
Thank you. Emilka, over to you.
Thank you. I fully endorse what Gillian and Five said before me. I think, from my perspective, one of the things we're grappling with in the work program that we've embarked on is accessibility of data. It's availability of data, as well as accessibility is being able to kind of access it ourselves. We're trained researchers and we often struggle. And I think a lot of information that we are looking for really is information that is of interest to wider society and to people, and should be much easier to access for people to be able to understand, to do their own analysis, or satisfy their curiosity on those things. So I wonder if there is some space for UN to provide a platform, for collating some of that information. And maybe, having conversations about the kinds of data that we would need that is currently missing. So in my line of work, we know quite a lot about impacts of mining projects, right? There is a lot of documented information about it. We know very little in terms of how climate change will affect those mining projects, what it will be like. And this kind of extractive hegemony that mining is the way forward here almost locks us into knowing less when we need to know more in order to be able to make those decisions and to forge those ways forward. So maybe some kind of data hub with workshops and conversations to assess what are some of the blind spots, and mobilizing people, like ourselves, like the researchers, to be very happy to help address some of those blind spots, if we can.
Thank you very much. I think the lack of data is also some of the challenges that we face in monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals and things like that too. And definitely, access to information is part of, business and human rights guiding principles as well. So it's definitely an important conversation, as well as what Five had proposed, having a forum where a safe place for people to talk, and hopefully we can at least do the preparation of it this afternoon, where we hear from all the participants on what more do we want to talk about in some of the forum that we plan in the future. Thank you very much. Do we have, Fanny, yes, please.
I have a long list of things that I would like the UN to do in this area of work, but I think I'll keep it to 3. One thing that the UN is really great at is in convening spaces and forums, and I think that they can do a little bit better in terms of building partnerships across 3 specific areas for this thing to happen. Partnerships for localization, for accelerating localization, partnerships for building, like accountability. They have access to all of this information, this knowledge, these experiences around the globe, and they are well positioned to do that. And of course, I think this is key. Partnerships for fostering policy coherence, particularly at national level, because sometimes you need a fresh pair of eyes. You need someone who's detached from national context to be able to say, look, here are the common threads, or here are the pathways that you're not seeing because you're here, you're directly responding. I think that the UN can focus on those 3 areas if you were to see some positive progress in this area.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And Howard, over to you. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I do feel a little bit of gender imbalance here, so I better speak up here and commend you all now that you talk about the UN, etc., etc. But no, definitely here. I mean, I don't think it's the science we need to discover more of, but I certainly, and so we have strongly asked for, data is so important. It's your starting point. Data, statistics, and so on. And of course, as current as possible. We seem to have had that issue in one of our countries, and Vani knows what I'm talking about. But definitely, data gathering and centralizing, having, for us in the Pacific, let's have it so that the whole region has access to data. Okay, we respect the sensitivity of some maybe, but I'm sure we're sensible and old enough to actually be able to see what we can share, because there's no point in recreating the wheel again. And there's so much knowledge out there. One of the things I found very effective when I was getting rural banking starting is going out to the villages, and we'd have our meeting with the villagers at 9 o'clock at night. Why? Because that's when mom would be finished with her daily chores and present herself. And as we would speak and talk and share about banking and how people can use banking to assist, it was the ladies who would rub their hands and answer the question while the gentleman would be sitting down deep in thought. And, we would say sometimes, enough thinking and let's get out and do it. So just as Nike says, just do it. And I think while the UN has a huge responsibility on its shoulders here, I think down at the practical level, and this is where I speak from the private sector and the business community, is, every day is time. Time is money, and profits is the big name. Right? Business profits, the economy profits, people profit, employees profit. So thank you for all your sharing there, ladies.
Thank you very much. We have gone 15 minutes over time, and I'm sorry, and thank you very much for sticking with us. So I think we'll, at this point, close the panel discussion. And it was really great to hear from all the panelists on the people-centered approach to making sure human rights is respected in the whole effort of just transition, and some of the important work that's happening from different sectors and perspectives. We will have a quick 15-minute break before moving into a consultation session. And then if the speakers are able to stay, that will be wonderful. If not, I know we have already asked for a long time this morning or this afternoon. And so thank you very much for all the contributions. And it was a very interesting panel. Thank you.
And thank you very much for bringing us all together and creating this space. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.